Hi everyone, I'm Cheryl Ward and I am here with Doan Shockley, and he is going to give us a little tip on uncorked wines, corked wines. How do you know when it's good and bad?
Exactly. We talked a little bit about types of corks and what the term corked means. That has a very specific meaning to those of us that are in the trade. So I thought we ought to talk a little bit about that. You hear that people talk about they got a corked bottle of wine often, but obviously all wine has corks in it unless it has a screw cap on it. When we talk about a bottle of wine that is corked, it means it's got an off musty flavor to it. And a lot of times it'll smell almost like dirty socks.
Ooh.
Or a musty basement. Yeah, you'll really know it if you get a bottle that's badly corked, but it can be very subtle. And it happens mainly because the cork is defective for some reason. And cork, it's a natural product. It's the bark of a tree actually. And sometimes it's got bacteria in it, and the bacteria will actually eat the cork. And so then the cork becomes contaminated, and that will affect the flavor of the wine and the aromas in the wine. So that's what we mean when we talk about a corked bottle of wine.
So it's not just actually having a cork
Exactly.
in the bottle of the wine? Like, you have to be the teacher for me. I don't know much about wine.
And the industry is getting over that, and you see more screw cap wines now. You never get a corked bottle if you have a screw cap. Obviously there's no cork in it. And you'll see some wines that have a synthetic cork in them as well, and you'll never get a corked bottle if you have a synthetic cork or a screw cap. So
it's just like a plastic? Or?
It's a molded plastic basically, and so it's impervious to bacteria. It doesn't deteriorate, and so therefore the wine should stay fresh no matter what. It still happens on very rare occasions. Happens a lot more often with this, and we expect it. We factor in, we know that out of every pallet of wine we're going to get X number of cork bottles, and it's just something to be expected because it is part of the process.
So now can somebody just smell the cork and they'll know, or they actually have to smell the dirty socks in the bottle?
You have to smell the dirty socks in the bottle. When the sommelier hands you the cork, you can look at it, don't smell it because you can't tell. You can get a really good wine from a cork that smells really, really bad. So that's not always a good indication. You can kind of twist it if the cork crumbles when you kind of do this to it. You're probably going to have a bad bottle of wine because there's that oxygen in it, which we'll talk about in a second. But when you look at the cork, you should make sure it's in good shape, and that's the main thing that you're doing there.
I've had a couple of corks crumble on me when I put the screw thing in and pull it out, and it just is like falling into my wine.
And sometimes that's okay too, because depending, like I said, you can have a bad smelling cork. You can have a crumbly cork. It doesn't always mean the wine's going to be bad. And so there could be pieces of cork in the wine, and that doesn't necessarily mean the wine is corked. It's got cork in it, but it won't affect the flavor or the aroma. So it's okay to drink a bottle. If your waiter's a little bit too aggressive sometimes, he'll push the cork down in there, it'll crumble.
Right.
And then that's okay. You might need to decant it to get the cork out, but it won't hurt it, and doesn't necessarily mean the wine is bad.
Now I'm hearing a lot of companies are doing boxed wines now too. Is that going to be the same as the synthetic corks?
It is, and boxed wines are great because the other thing that can happen to wines, it can become oxidized. If the cork gets wet or it shrinks up and lets oxygen down into the bottle, oxygen is wine's worst enemy. It gives it almost a vinegary smell and flavor to it, and if you have a bag in a box, there's no oxygen that can get to it because the bag contracts around and you never get any air in there. So it will never turn bad or oxidize if you have a bag in a box. Now sometimes you want that because we talked, I think last time, about letting wines breathe.
Yes, the breathe.
So you miss that with the bag in the box wine. And when you open the cork, you let it breathe, especially with some of the more complex wines. As they open up, the flavors will change and the complexity will change, and you'll get different aromas and different nuances to the wine. So if you're going to have a box in the refrigerator for a month, it's okay. But if you're enjoying a really nice bottle of wine, you often want to let it breathe.
Okay.
So
I will remember that now. And then I guess my other question to you is, what makes wine, you said oxygen is wine's enemy. Are there other things that make wine just, I know if you leave them in the fridge too long and you don't drink the bottle, it doesn't have the same taste.
And that's because once you open the bottle, it lets oxygen in there. So after 3 or 4 days, it's going to start oxidizing, even though it started off good. So by day 2, it might have changed. It's probably still going to be okay. Day 4, it's probably not going to be as good as it was when you open it. And you can get the vacuum pumps that you can pump the air out of them, and that will help it stay long. There's some sprays that you can spray in there as well, and it displaces the oxygen. It leaves nitrogen in there, which doesn't react with the wine, and it will last up to 4 or 5 days sometimes if you do that. So that will work. The other worst enemy, it is good to refrigerate them because heat is the other enemy of wine. And you'll often hear the term that the wine was cooked. And literally, it got too hot and it cooks the wine and it gives it a bad flavor. And some people call it Madeirized. It's like Madeira, is they actually do that. They heat the wine and it kind of undergoes a secondary fermentation. And it gives it a different flavor and texture, and it's almost like a nutty flavor to it. And we like that in some dessert wines, but you don't want that in a nice bottle of red wine.
So would you refrigerate your red wine too, and then just take it out and sit for a while?
Nah, if it's going to be I never have to refrigerate them because I open them and they're typically gone that day. But if you're going to keep a bottle for a couple of days, yeah, it wouldn't hurt to keep it in the refrigerator and let it warm up just a little bit before you drink it if it's a red wine. And obviously, always keep your white wines chilled.
Yes.
That's a little bit about what happens to wines. I guess the other thing can happen, sometimes they'll undergo a secondary fermentation in the bottle, and that happens because yeast, it's a living organism, and in theory, when you make a wine, the yeast eats the sugar that's in the grapes, and it produces alcohol, and that's how you get the wine. Sometimes there might be a little bit of the yeast left in there, and at some point, maybe that yeast kind of reactivates, and it'll undergo a secondary fermentation. It'll get a little bit of a fizz to it almost, and that's acceptable in champagne. We look for that, but not in most still wines. So that's probably the fourth thing that can happen to wines.
So those are 4 things you don't want to happen to
Exactly.
your good bottle of wine. All right, well, thank you, Doan.
Thank you.
For teaching us a little bit more about Corked, and you can check us out at Facebook. This is Martin Ulisse Imports.